a repeat customer. He presented last year. He got promoted to keynote speaker. Justin Guest, I'm just going to read his bio because, and you know, this bio doesn't do justice to Justin and all his great work. He's an assistant professor, and I'm like, what? He should be associate already, but he's getting there. He's done really great work. He's an assistant professor of public policy at George Mason University's Schar School of Policy and Government in DC. He's the author of Apart, Alienated and Engaged Muslims in the West. That's one book. Another book is called The New Minority, White Working Class Politics in an Age of Immigration and Inequality. And soon he will have a third book out called Crossroads, Comparative Immigration Regimes in the World of Demographic Change. Assistant professor with 3 books, so yeah. You put us all to shame. His articles have appeared in numerous journals, including Comparative Political Studies, Ethnic and Migration Studies, and International Migration Review. And he's also done a lot of kind of media analysis and is frequently sought after for his opinions, including by the BBC, CNN, The Guardian, Politico, and The Washington Post. So, are you leaving? Oh, yeah, that's right. So Justin has prepared for us a presentation. You can see here's called The Market Model, the Commodification of Migrants and Their Rights. He'll speak for about 35 minutes, and again, there's opportunity for you guys to engage with him and ask questions afterwards. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Justin.
Thank you, Elle. Thank you, Elle. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for hosting another one of these amazing conferences. I have run a conference before. It wasn't this successful, and it was a lot of work. And so a lot of appreciation to Els for the coordination that she put into this, the effort, but also for actually generating reasons for all of us to come together, to share our ideas, to meet each other. These fora are really important, they're precious, and Els is constantly throughout her career doing these kinds of things to bring us all together, so I'm very grateful. I'm presenting really a sort of a mix of work that I'm putting into a general theme that I call the market model, the commodification of migrants and their rights. And this is based on really 2 pieces of work that I'll blend together into a general argument during the presentation. The first piece of work is work with Tom Wong from the UC San Diego on migrants' rights, and the other is work with Anna Boucher from the University of Sydney, which is part of my co-author on the book that Els kindly mentioned, Crossroads. So I'll go through what the agenda of the presentation will look like. So I'll begin with discussing the sorry, hopeful, confused state of affairs as it relates to migrants' rights around the world today. And then I'll jump into some of the data. I'll discuss some new tools for referencing and benchmarking migrants' rights and immigration policymaking. And then I'll discuss the relationship between the regimes that we construct for immigrants and the rights therein. Then I will talk about briefly how we can resist the commodification of migrants, because I know that we have a lot of activists in the room as well, so I want to make sure we have some policy implications and some public implications in there. And then finally, I will offer some shameless plugs for my work. You've been warned, so that's the time you want to go to the bathroom. Okay, so just by way of background, because not everyone is following this sorry, so hopeful state of global affairs right now. Back in 1989, Phil Martin wrote, "The international law currently plays no real role in shaping migration policy and practice. Migration policy is often regarded as the last major redoubt of unfettered national sovereignty." And this is because the decline, however, the decline in state power attributable to the increasing relevance of international human rights regimes that override state decisions about border crossings, things start to change a little bit. And we start to hear some dissent. But nevertheless, despite all the sort of rumblings of human rights, sovereignty consistently wins. And one of the reasons why it has consistently won is that migration is different from other global issues that states have attempted to govern at the supranational level. And that's because rising seas do not discriminate about different shores. Similarly, trade is via private financial transactions. On the other hand, migration, an individual migrant approaches one border at a time, and that way they are more controllable than water, air, or money. This is the list of countries mapped that have approved or ratified the International Convention for the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of Their Families, also known as the Migrant Workers Convention. Taking photos. You can Google this, it's up there. So this is the list of countries. And what you'll see, of course, is that it's pretty obvious who is saying yes to limits on their sovereignty for the regulation of migrant rights. It is the countries that tend to send migrants rather than who tend to receive migrants. There are a few exceptions with countries like Mexico, Morocco, and Turkey, which eventually, and maybe Indonesia to a certain extent, and the Philippines, which to limited degrees are now becoming countries of transit, particularly Mexico, Turkey, and Morocco. And there are a few exceptions in Latin America as well, which is now really changing because of the Venezuelan refugee crisis. However, generally speaking, these are countries of sending. And of course, at the time that they were ratified, they were even more countries of sending. And so effectively, we see a quarantine when it comes to migration and migrants' rights. Pierre Hasselman wrote that the first world more and more sees the second world either as a threat or as a Pandora's box of insoluble problems, for whom nothing much positive can be done, but from which one should, above all, be isolated, so as not to sink into the quicksands or be contaminated by its illnesses. Inside the Migrant Workers Convention, though, despite the fact that none of the Global North countries ratified it, there were tons of capitulations to countries in the Global North that really made it an inadequate instrument for the protection of migrants' rights. First, it had an appropriate measures clause against people who are undocumented, that states could take appropriate measures against them. Very vague, and it could basically be mapped onto it whatever you wish. Second, there is an exclusive focus on migrant workers. And workers are only certain types of immigrants. Many immigrants, as everyone here knows, migrate for reasons other than labor. Family applies, the definition of family applies the Western nuclear model. And finally, it is an enormous document and without a lot of translations complete. Enormous document. So it's not exactly, it has not exactly been a successful supranational governmental effort. Has anything changed since then? In some ways, yes, and very importantly. Since the Migrant Workers Convention's failure, we've seen the empowerment of numerous non-state actors that have diluted the control of state and diluted their power in governing migrant rights. In particular, sending countries now advocate far more fiercely than they once did and are acknowledging their status as transit countries and are acknowledging their need to actually be responsible for the migrant rights that they otherwise advocate for in the Global North. Second, social networks have empowered migrants, but also their allies in a fight against states, in empowering them to both create more transparency and actually to share information. Third, employers recognize the power and the development potential of migrants and what they can do for economies, and they have lobbied their governments to actually facilitate migration in a safe and orderly manner. And finally, human traffickers have demonstrated the ability of migrants and also conspirators to both exploit migrants, but also to facilitate their movement under the nose of the state despite state regulation and enforcement of borders. All of these things have diluted state power in key ways, but it's sometimes hard to tell that this is true. At the summit addressing large movements of refugees and migrants, which was held at the United Nations back in 2016, this was motivated by precisely that moment in Europe that we've been talking about and that Sarah's presentation earlier discussed, the migrant/asylum seeker crisis in Europe in 2015 and 2016. This motivated governments to finally come to the bargaining table and say something must be done to address this system because it's not working. It was a historic opportunity to do this for a very global issue, to govern it at the global level. The New York Declaration was created, and it created a path to the global compacts for migration and refugees that are currently being negotiated just uptown as we speak, really. However, what the New York Declaration said it was going to do is the following. Read this very carefully. We are going to commit to consider adopting non-binding guiding principles. What? What does that even mean? If I told my wife that when we were getting married, she would have ended it right away. It hardly inspires a lot of confidence. There's one problem, though, with all of this. One problem with states' continued assertion of their sovereignty. And that is, as Alex Alenikoff, who works just down the street from here, has written previously, that states have already circumscribed themselves because they have ratified a fairly detailed, even if not comprehensive, set of legal rules, multilateral conventions, and bilateral agreements that constrain and channel state authority over migration. States have constrained themselves. Virginie Guiraudon has also written that there is a legally driven process of self-limited sovereignty. It's almost like the opposite of self-deportation. In the New York Declaration, it even states that the declaration will ensure full respect and protection for migrants' human rights and fundamental freedoms, whether they are in transit, but also after arrival. The Declaration and its appendices are to be implemented in a manner that is consistent with the rights and obligations of states under international law. And so states have continued this self-constraining theme. The International Bill of Rights, which was actually created, really stimulated by the work of Alenikoff, which I actually co-chair. You're welcome to look it up. I'll show you the link later. Consolidates the key rights of migrants based on this current patchwork of international law and standards. They actually bring it together. It's all lawyers, by the way. I'm the only one who's not a lawyer, which is good. It's a good thing. They bring it together into 23 core articles drawn from the core human rights treaties. And it uses it as a check against derogation from supranational law. It also can be used to benchmark countries' adherence to the rights that they have already subscribed to and enshrined in the suite of international treaties. And so, if we use that Bill of Rights that I just mentioned to check the New York Declaration, we find derogation all over the place. First, the New York Declaration fails to recognize the rights to legal personhood and to nationality to which stateless migrants are particularly vulnerable. Second, the Declaration affirms the right to family unification for refugees, but not for all other migrants. Third, it fails to fulfill states' obligation to provide access to asylum procedures for all migrants. Again, only for a subset. But wait, there's more. Fourth, the right against expulsion does not include freedom from discriminatory or arbitrary expulsion or deportation. Fifth, it fails to protect the rights of all migrants to liberty and security of person and against arbitrary arrest and detention, which is very much in states' interest. And finally, the Declaration does not reflect protections for migrant victims of crime during their journeys into and in the host country. So there are a lot of gaps in what the New York Declaration is doing. Despite that it is trying to create new international laws, it is actually derogating from the international laws in the process of its creation. And it's important that the Global Compact doesn't do the same. So, in order to actually study this more carefully, with Tom Wong, I created the Migrants' Rights Database, which was sponsored by the Nomad Initiative at the World Bank. And this is a working paper that will be posted on the World Bank site. It won't be published anywhere else, so this will be its final publication. Sometime in the next few weeks, actually. I think it's due for like May 1st. We take 65 binary indicators, and we actually hire real live lawyers to code. And it's double coded per country, and it's blindly coded, meaning one lawyer doesn't see what the other one codes, and we resolve any disputes to reduce intercoder reliability bias. They code the 65 indicators for 2017, and the indicators themselves are transparent, aggregatable, and also replicable. In other words, if we want to recheck what their work is, you could just follow what the legal citations were that the lawyers cited, and actually see the laws that are the basis for the human rights that we find. And finally, we use it on 5 pilot countries, and that's why it's a working paper. We're not going to publish anywhere else. It's too few countries to really study broadly, but it's a pilot, and so we very much hope to. We're going to be studying another 5 this summer, and if anyone wants to code like Morocco, just let me know, and we'll send you the instrument. This is what we find. This is going to be too much information at once. But this matrix, it's a little bit off the screen, but at the very top, you'll see the countries: Germany, Mexico, Russia, South Africa, and Turkey. And here, you'll see the number of indicators in parentheses and the actual category of indicators. So the rights associated with vulnerable migrants, life, liberty, legal personhood, due process for victims of crime, etc. You can actually go on the IMBR website if you want to see these precisely what these principles are. But the bottom line, and I'm not sure if everyone can see the bottom line, is down here. Can you raise your hand if you cannot see what those scores are? People in the back. Okay, people in the back. The scores are, for Germany, it's 0.69. That means about 69% of the rights are actually covered. For Mexico, it's 72%. For Russia, it's 65. For South Africa, it's 73. And for Turkey, it's 66, rounding. So we see some clumping, but we also see some variation inside the clumping. And what we really notice, and now you can probably see the numbers, is that Mexico and South Africa, as principally countries of sending, but also transit now, see a lot of upside in migrants' rights. And so they sign on to a lot of migrant right protections. The question is whether they implement them. Mexico is notorious for basically, está firmando todo, they'll sign anything you put in front of them, but will they actually protect the rights inside of their country? Not necessarily. They will, there's lots of excuses I've heard when I go to Mexico and discuss these things, but the fact is that they sign on to a lot, but not necessarily enforce it in the country with the migrants in transit. In Germany, there's a greater wariness to actually sign on to a lot of rights because they fear that they will actually have to implement it in their country. And then finally, in Russia, you effectively have organized disorder. What's interesting to us, though, is that Russia did not derogate nearly as far as we thought it might. Same with Turkey. Turkey was the second most incomplete protection of migrants' rights. Either way, what these things can do by rating and benchmarking what states are covering immigrant rights, it actually forms a baseline for the negotiations for the Global Compact. Once states know that they have already agreed to so many migrants' rights by virtue of a suite of international rights treaties, it actually should inspire them to just sign on to more things because they're not signing on to anything new. They're just agreeing to do what they've already committed to do previously. This is basically encapsulates work by my colleague Martin Roos from Oxford, who finds that there's a trade-off between what rights states offer and the openness of their migration regimes, particularly to citizenship and migrants themselves. So what he finds, and he focuses exclusively on labor migrants, I should emphasize, but with labor migrants, he finds that as the amount of migrants that enter a country goes up, the amount of rights to which they're entitled goes down. So effectively, we see a trade-off, an equilibrium when it comes to migrants' rights over time and across countries. What does this equilibrium look like? Well, first, states clearly desire migrants for economic and possibly even demographic reasons. They need people to take jobs, to fill gaps in certain skilled positions and low-skilled positions, and they also need to get younger in many cases. On the other hand, many states are averse to migrants because of resource-sharing concerns, cultural differences, and for other demographic reasons related to differences in religion or ethnicity. And so effectively, this balances these things out to an equilibrium where we want migrants, but we're not going to give them any rights that actually facilitate their permanent settlement or their enfranchisement into our society. The point here is that the baby is in the bathwater. You cannot have migrants and then not respect their rights because it's actually a violation of the supranational laws to which you are adhering, or at least supposed to adhere. So the question is, how do states respond to this in the way that they are governing immigration more broadly? And this is what I'm going to focus the rest of the presentation on. This is work from the Crossroads database that I mentioned in my work with Anna Boucher from the University of Sydney. Rather than looking at the laws that are on the books, we actually look at the outcomes. We focus on what immigrants come into the country and in what quantities. So we have a database that is compiled across 50 primary destination countries. And when I say it's compiled, I mean we don't collect the data. So we rely on national statistics offices to share it with us, the OECD, the United Nations, a few development banks, etc. Sometimes we actually have to visit in person. Our sources are a variety, and it took us a very long time to compile all these data. It took us about 6 years. Now, obviously, that's not full time, but I got a kid, we teach, etc. It took 6 years total, with a lot of research assistance across a lot of countries. And the reason why it takes so long is because states don't often want to share these outcome data with you. In some cases, like in the Arabian Gulf region, they are matters of national security. We use single-year observations from 2011 that are replicable annually. By replicable, I mean that the methods and the way we conceptualize immigration regimes means that this could be collected once 2018 data becomes available, or once 1990 data becomes available. But for now, the only comprehensive year that we identified was 2011. We collect these data across 7 outcomes, and we have complete data for 30 countries. And so those 30 countries represent the core states that we focus our analysis on. These are the countries from which we have data. And these are the outcomes. I'll go through each outcome one by one. So the first, and many of you will be familiar with these, but some of you won't, so I'll just go through. Total migrant flows. This is quite simply an indication of the scale of a migration regime. This is the amount of foreigners on permanent and temporary visas who enter a given country in a given year. It's how many people you let in. Second is temporary migrant flows, which is what it says it is. It's the amount of migrants that are temporary among the total flows, as a share of the total flows. And I should emphasize, by the way, that this is also as a share of the national population. So that way we can compare apples and apples across states. This is as a share of the total visas coming in a given year. Economic flows are economic emissions, permanent, I should emphasize, permanent economic emissions as a share of total flows. Family is, and this, by the way, includes entrepreneurs, high-skilled migrants, low-skilled migrants, anyone who's on a permanent visa. It could be an intercompany transfer if that's actually a permanent visa. Sorry, let me go back one more time. This also includes family members who are accompanying someone on an economic visa. So it's called accompanying family. Then there's a separate category for family flows. So this is spouses, adult children, young children, parents. It can be uncles, aunts, foundlings, orphans, etc. Humanitarian flows are refugees and asylum seekers. Free movement flows, it's sort of a catch-all of other visas, but it's principally free movement. So this is people who are inside countries with free movement arrangements like the European Union, Mercosur, the Trans-Tasman Agreement between New Zealand and Australia. And then finally, we include naturalization rates. And this is a share of immigrant stock that naturalizes in a given year. We take all 7 of these outcomes across 30 countries and we put them into what's called a K-means clustering algorithm. A K-means clustering algorithm is something that we all participate in every day of our lives. So what this is an algorithm that produces a typology. It yields a classification system. And it minimizes the distance within the clusters that it creates, and it maximizes the distance across them. If this seems too abstract, when you guys go on OpenTable.com or Rotten Tomatoes to rate movies, to book restaurants, or frankly, to pretty much Google anything or you can consume on the internet, the websites are creating typologies of consumers. They are saying, okay, Justin likes horror films and he likes blockbusters and he sees them on the west side of Manhattan. Right? So I'm a certain type of consumer. We are doing the same thing, but rather than making typologies of consumers, we're creating typologies of immigration regimes. We're looking at their preferences for immigrants rather than preferences for restaurants or movies. The algorithm is stable, meaning you can run it over and over again and you get the same results. And the only thing that we supervise, meaning the only thing we tell, the way we define the algorithm, is by telling it how many clusters we want to see. And we ask for 7, and that seems arbitrary, but it's because we actually looked at what 2 through 9 clusters produces, and 7 was the most intuitive. I can go into the methods behind that if you're interested, but for now, just rest assured, it's 7. This is the taxonomy that is produced. So the algorithm does not produce the names of the types. That's all our fault. So if you have problems with the names, that's us. Otherwise, the data is speaking for itself. I'll go through each of these now, one by one, so we can understand what's going on in each of these clusters. So in the neoliberal regimes, this includes Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom. This is a spider plot, meaning we plot the values of each of these different variables, humanitarian, family, work, total flows, etc. And we can see how tightly the cluster is bound together. And we see a pretty tight cluster, except that Canada is a bit of an exception, because it spikes when it comes to humanitarian migration, and it spikes when it comes to naturalization rate. Otherwise, these countries are rather similar. It's because they all share rather high naturalization rates, high temporary migration flows, and a very strong focus on labor. And this is something that we don't often associate with these countries, which are often sort of paragons of immigration policy. They actually have very high levels of temporary migration, and they focus very heavily on visa due to the points-based systems that they employ. The second group are intra-union regimes, intra-union regimes. These are regimes including Austria, Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, and Switzerland. They have moderate flows, but very high free movement. They tend to rely on intra-EU migration very, very heavily. Moderate temporary flows and lower naturalization rates, which is not surprising if you think about lower naturalization rates, because if you are an internal to the EU migrant, your motivation to gain citizenship in a different country is lower because you have access to all the benefits and rights that you otherwise would have as a citizen, and you probably expect to return home soon. Extra-union regimes are mostly Western and Southern European countries: Belgium, France, Ireland, Italy, Portugal, and Spain. They have moderate flows, higher naturalization rates, a more balanced mix, and low temporary migration. They still have rather high free movement, just not as high as the intra-union regimes. And because they have more third country nationals coming in, they naturalize more people than the intra-union regimes. Humanitarian regimes include Finland, Sweden, and the United States. One thing I will emphasize is that the United States is an outlier. And I'll go back to this at the end of the presentation. But the United States is a weird country for lots of reasons. And one thing that this points out to us is that a gap in this particular database is that we don't consider undocumented migration. We consider it part of a regime, but we just don't have reliable data to study it across 30 countries. If you think of undocumented immigrants in the United States as effectively low-skilled temporary workers, then really the United States starts to look maybe a little bit more like the neoliberal regimes, actually. But they lack the sort of labor focus when you think about all the family migrants here. It really is an outlier in lots of ways. But in any case, without undocumented immigrants in consideration, it looks actually more like Finland and Sweden. Higher humanitarian flows, and remember this is done before the Trump regime, high family flows, low labor, and higher naturalization rates. Again, that will all change if we were to look at 2017 data inside the United States. Things have changed. But of course, the same is true for other countries too. We're snapshotting a moment in time. We're freezing time. The kafala regimes are a unique, or used to be really, a unique migration regime. Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, and Saudi Arabia. They have high flows. It's exclusively temporary migration, zero naturalization with the exception of Bahrain, which is a very interesting story. If anyone wants to hear about Bahrain, just ask a good question. And a heavy labor focus. Why does Bahrain naturalize people and no one else does? You'll see that missing here are Qatar and also the UAE. They are missing because we lacked one data point and we didn't want to impute it. We don't impute any data, and so we just left them out. But rest assured, that's where they would be if we had the data. They look exactly like the rest of these regimes. Then we have the quasi-kafala regimes. These are effectively wannabe kafalas, but not with the same scale. So they have the same temporary, no naturalization labor focus as the kafalas, but they have lower flows. And again, you see a relatively tight cluster. And then finally, off the screen for some reason, you have constrained regimes. I don't know why that just happened. Constrained regimes include Brazil, Mexico, Japan, and Korea. Those four countries do not sound similar, and it's because they are constrained for different reasons. They all look similar, though, because they have relatively low naturalization rates, low free movement, or no free movement, really, high temporary migration with a kind of balance between work and family visas. However, they're constrained for different reasons. Japan and Korea effectively self-constrain themselves because they don't want immigrants. And so they are self-constrained despite a rather strong economy. Whereas Mexico and Brazil don't have the same kind of demand for migration as those East Asian countries do. So this is the typology that's created. And what we are viewing when we actually look at the data, despite the divergence that we observe, we also observe a lot of interesting convergence that relates back to the previous part of the lecture about migrants' rights. What we see emerging is what we call a market model. So let's just look at how these trends are converging. The market model is basically founded upon 4 key findings from these data. The first is that we see very large numbers of temporary migrants going to these different countries. And it really doesn't discriminate. The only countries that have very few temporary migrants are some of the Western Europeans and the humanitarian regimes. But again, the humanitarian regimes include the United States, which has an enormous amount of undocumented migrants. We see less naturalization, and I'll show you the data graphically in a moment. We see a very strong labor focus, and we see more pre-screening by countries about who comes into the country before they actually give up the rights and citizenship. Here's what the data looks like. This is mean pooled naturalization rates across a 25-year period. And what we see is that that rate spikes up here, right about 2000, just before the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And then everything starts to climb back down to 1990 levels. And remember, the scale is not gigantic, but the fact that you have so many countries here suggests that this is significant. And this is really the money graph. This graph tells you really everything you need to know, because it's a bar graph that actually includes all the different visa types along with temporary migration in the pink. And what you'll see is that pink really dominates for so many countries who is actually coming into their countries. But now if you adjust your eyes and look not just at the pink sections, but combine pink with red and with yellow. And what you'll see is that the green and blue sections really occupy almost no space at all, with the only exception really being the United States, and maybe you could say Ireland, Portugal, France. Countries' visa mixes are dominated today by temporary and labor migrants. And so this is forming a kind of a market model that is interested in migrants in many ways the way Uber works. This is the Uberization of immigration. We want to recruit migrants, we're going to make them work, and then we're going to discard them at will. That is the way migration regimes are trending, which has huge implications for the rights obligations of states as they pertain to migrant workers. So the momentum follows the marketization of labor markets more generally, of which Uber and the gig economy really crystallizes. Second, it's a sustainable defense for politicians against populism, which, as you may have noticed, is in a wave right now. This relates to my last book, The New Minority, if you're interested in white working class politics behind populism. So the populism can be, these politicians think that it can be satiated if they can sell migration as being temporary and only when we need them to work and not for any other reasons, like they're vulnerable for humanitarian purposes as part of an obligation or family obligations. And finally, all of this is inflamed by the paranoia around international terrorism. And this relates to my first book that I also kindly mentioned, Apart. As a response to the securitization of immigration, states are insisting that migrants come on a more temporary, contingent basis. How can we resist this commodification of migrants and their rights? I have 3 ideas that I'll share. I don't think they're going to solve all your problems, but at least it stimulates us to think more proactively about all this. First, we must humanize contingency. We must tell human stories, and we must talk about immigrants instead of immigration. Political behavior data shows the difference about when we talk about migrants as individuals and as families and as human beings, rather than when we talk about migration as a phenomenon itself. It feels like a flood versus drops of water. Second, we must reveal the development prospects that arise from making migrants permanent and giving them a permanent basis in our society, and give them the accountability that that creates, the enfranchisement, the integration that that facilitates. And second, we cannot reinforce special treatment. We should be insisting on human rights, universal human rights-based frameworks for everyone, and not focusing exclusively on refugees. So far, there's been such a concern with protecting refugees for obvious and very important reasons, but we can't do this at the detriment by actually excluding the rest of migrants from the rights that really matter. So I'll conclude there, and now comes the section with the shameless plugs. if you want to read more about these things, because I really can't capture all the sort of details of my work in these presentations, Crossroads is out literally next month with Cambridge University Press. The full title is Crossroads, Comparative Immigration Regimes in a World of Demographic Change. If you want to read about the book in advance, crossroads.earth is the website, and you'll see there's a sample preface, an excerpt from the book. There's also some reviews, and there's also, if any of you teach data visualizations that students really enjoy because they can actually make the data work for them, and so they can play around with data visualizations using the real live data that we use in the book. The Migrants' Rights Database will be a working paper, as I mentioned, through Nomad at the World Bank. That will come out next month, probably around May 1st. If you want to learn more about the IMBR, the International Migrants Bill of Rights, imbr.info, and it'll take you to the webpage, which is currently based at Georgetown University Law Center. Also, if you can't wait to read the book Crossroads, the New York Times did a really good piece where they took all of my data and barely cited me. Those are the authors of the piece. And if you look at this table, this bar graph that they create, it looks a lot like my bar graph, but it's a lot better, because they have much better graphic skills at the New York Times. And all the way at the bottom of the little fine print, it says it's from Justin Guest and Anna Boucher. But anyway, it's still a good piece. They did a really good job. And if you just Google it, you can read about some of the findings from the piece. And similarly, I wrote an op-ed for, it doesn't actually show, but Politico. This is from Politico.com, and it's called How America Fell Behind the World on Immigration. And that gets into the details about why America is so exceptional, how we got here, and what America actually needs to do to actually try to fix this so we can catch up with the world in good ways and not catch up with the rest of the world in the nasty ways. That's important. Thanks very much for your attention. I'm happy to hear your questions.
Thank you for that amazing presentation, and what an amazing data set you are working with and created. So I actually want to open up the floor right away. We have about 20 minutes for comments, questions, reflections. You could ask him about particular cases, as he suggested, Marie, for example. So yeah, please go ahead and line up. We'll start with you, David.
Great. So thank you for...
We only have one mic because Justin is holding the other one. So go ahead.
Thank you for the great presentation. Very intriguing, very, very interesting in terms of the quants and stats you presented. I was curious on two levels about the presentation. Firstly, issues of access to some of the numbers, particularly in some of the Middle Eastern regimes, which might not be particularly open in terms of providing a lot of the numbers. And I'm specifically thinking about human trafficking, which in places like Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, a lot of people coming from South Asia and Eastern Africa and getting really abused and treated badly. So could you speak to some of those gaps and sort of accessing some of those numbers which might not be reported? And then secondly, in relation to the commodification of migrants, to what extent is the commodification of migrants directly related to the weakening of union strength in the United States? And I'm particularly thinking about, say, red states and how that affects the commodification of migrants. Is it getting worse because unions are getting weaker? Could you speak a bit to that? Thanks.
Sure. Do you mind just specifying what aspect of the data from the Arab world that you were interested in?
Just generally, specifically, migrant numbers that are not reported. So people who are particularly trafficked, and whether that would affect any of your numbers.
Okay, sure. So I'm going to give quick answers just so we can facilitate more questions, but if I'm not thorough enough, let me know. So in the Arabian Peninsula region, we really are at the mercy of the state's numbers, and that's one of the reasons why we didn't want to impute, but also one of the reasons why I actually had to go to Kuwait in order to get some of the data there because they weren't going to share it otherwise. We can't bank on any of the national statistics data. So demography is actually very good when it comes to aging, death, and birth. it's not good with migration, and it's just something that we kind of had to be okay with because there are no other sources. The National Statistics Agencies also provide those statistics to the UN and to the OECD. So there are likely some gaps there, but the numbers are still rather high. So in, I think the highest we have is like Kuwait, which is at 75%, but we know, and Bahrain is also around there too, 60, 70% percentile. We know though that Qatar and the UAE are also in the 80s. So the data that is reported is pretty mind-blowingly high. And frankly, just walking around, Abu Dhabi or Kuwait City, you'll see just what the data would otherwise suggest. So while there is some gaps in reporting, it's actually not easy to migrate without documentation into these countries. What tends to happen are visa overstays. There is some trafficking, but more than anything, you see a lot of visa overstays and runaways from the people who they're contracted with. The word kafala, I realize I didn't define that. Kafala is the Arabic word for sponsorship. It comes from kafil, which literally means to sponsor. So all of their immigrants are based on employer-sponsored contracts. So a lot of the undocumented migration is when people actually run away from their employers and seek work on the black market, which is really precarious. It's covered by our colleague Noor Lori really well in her work over at Boston University. So I'd recommend checking out her stuff. With regard to unions, yes, the weakening of unions does relate to greater precarity, but not just of immigrants, of all people. I mean, that's the irony behind the populist wave, is that one of the ways that they want to punish people for their contingency is to make migrants contingent too. And that's the sad part about all of this. Unions' deterioration has been harmful, but it's also the nature of the global economy. People don't work in workplaces where they work in large teams or on assembly lines anymore. They're more atomized in their work, and this is some stuff that I covered in my work, in my research on white working class people as well. And I do think that that's very much correlated. Thanks, David.
Hi, Liza Steele, SUNY Purchase. Thanks for your talk. I have a couple of questions. One is just I wanted to hear more about the K-means clustering algorithm and how you applied it to these data. And the other is about the slide that you said is mostly pink. And first of all, looked about half-half to me, but I thought I was hearing from you like a story about temporality, that we're moving towards having more temporary visas. I think that is the case in particular countries, but a lot of the countries with the most pink have never allowed naturalization, and at least not in their recent histories. So I just wanted you to talk more about your thinking on that.
Thanks, Liza. So the K-means clustering algorithm is effectively off the shelf from R, and it's an algorithm that is literally used to create systems of classification. So the algorithm is programmed to actually minimize the distance between within each cluster. So you're basically pulling cases together when their numbers actually look alike, and you maximize the distance between the cluster across the clusters. And so it's basically creating these typologies for you. Now you could weight the data. We chose not to. We could design, precisely how certain variables should be factored in different ways. We could bunch certain ones together. We didn't do that. We just let these 7 variables speak for themselves. Obviously, all of our work is going to be, up on the internet and in the book, and so people can literally rerun the same algorithm with weighting, excluding certain variables. Like if you don't want naturalization rates in there, you could do that. But it's, so you'll get different results if you do that, by the way. So that is one, issue with algorithms, is that it is subject to the controls that you put on it. And for that reason, we were hands off. So we don't have data on temporary migration over time. Otherwise, I would show trends in temporary migration. What we do have, though, is qualitative and secondary source evidence. And Stephen Castles quite famously wrote that the guest worker model is dead. And I think that was in like 1990 or something like that, or 1995, I'm not sure exactly when it was. But he wrote that it was dead. It was based on the nature of laws. And what we see is that that is just so far from the truth now, even in countries that were not subject to guest worker programs like the kafala regimes that you were referring to. So we are seeing that in a lot of interesting places that previously it wasn't as prominent in. What we're also seeing, though, is, you're right, it was divided in half. But remember, that's just one type of visa that's dividing, that's taking up about 50% of all visas across those 30 countries. That's remarkable, that temporary migration is basically happening. And when we combine that with the red and the yellow that I mentioned, what we see is this combination between temporary work and work more generally. And the yellow, of course, was the free movement, which I associate with work because that is the purpose of free movement arrangements. You're creating labor mobility. So effectively, work or temporary work or free movement work, which tends to be temporal in nature, is making up an enormous amount of that graph. And so while it all may not be explicitly temporary, I think that the preponderance of those visa types is really quite stunning.
Hi, thank you so much for a fascinating talk, and I'm really excited to dig into the research that's coming out. The ability to conduct data visualizations and replications is especially exciting. I'm Beth Wellman from Yale University. One question for you. So you have this map of the 30 countries that you're taking the snapshot. The one region that's totally missing is Sub-Saharan Africa. As someone who collects migration data on Africa, I completely sympathize with the difficulties of data collection, but still, I know it's probably, I'm wondering if it's an issue of no data or incomplete data, and for the countries that you do have some data, if you are able to do some type of partial analysis that conforms to these 7 typologies, or what you've found, if you've done any work, because it's a pretty conspicuous omission.
100% agreement. It is both no data and incomplete data. It depends on the country.
Sure.
It was just impossible. The only country where we got close, to answer your question about some data, is South Africa, which you're not surprised by. You guessed it. It was missing naturalization rates. FYI, so was Israel and so was Argentina, and so we couldn't include those either. We threw them out because one data missing, we're not going to impute. The reason why we didn't want to impute these kinds of data, even for South Africa, is because we have no basis for predicting what that number will look like. Right? We're the first ones who are doing this analysis, so we're the ones that are going to tell you what to expect from naturalization rates based on admissions policies. But we really don't know. We're learning for ourselves, and so for that reason, we didn't want to we only want to work on concrete data reported by the government. So South Africa is the only one. That data will feature in the book, and we do talk about South Africa. It's just not in the 30-country analysis because we don't have complete data for it. What I will say, though, and this is just speculation, so I don't think we actually wrote this, but personally speaking, I know for a fact that if we had actual data from a country like Kenya, Uganda, most of these sub-Saharan African countries, in fact, a lot of African countries more broadly, you would see a different 8th type, indubitably. Because you have countries that you think Norway is humanitarian migration, wait till you see Kenya. It's almost exclusively humanitarian migration, right? So that's a real humanitarian migration regime. So for that reason, these types that we create this system of classification, I think is dynamic. It changes with the data that you input, and as more data becomes available, we'll be able to recognize more regimes as they exist, particularly in places like Africa. Daniel, yeah.
Thanks, Justin. Like always, an excellent presentation and really and amazing global reach with certain caveats of your data. As most researchers, I come up with a question about desegregation. We talked about increasing trend of, or the strong element of temporary visas. I think your graph was amazing. I've seen at the UN when you presented at the coordination meeting a couple of months ago. But do you have any data on disaggregated temporary statuses? Because not all temporary visas are the same. If you're coming on an H-1B, which can then transition into a long-term basis here, it's a temporary visa. But if you go to Qatar or go to most of the kafala system countries, well, you can never transition out of your temporary visa. So in addition to having this aggregated of temporary, do we have it disaggregated? And do you also look at not just the flows or the stock to say, well, we know that the vast majority of migrants in the Middle East, for example, are there on temporary visas. Again, which tells us something not just about the flow into 2011, but about the overall regime of immigrants there. So can you say something about this disaggregation, how that affects this? Thank you.
Sure, thanks. The important question. So if we could have disaggregated, rest assured we would have disaggregated. That data is simply not available, and to send your complaints, march back up to the United Nations, find the OECD's Permanent Observer Office, and let them have it. We rely on the OECD definitions, and we rely a lot on their data. Some countries do a good job of disaggregating. It's often the usual suspects that are good with data, and others do not. And so we weren't even close to a 30-country sample size when it comes to disaggregate data. Very, very, very limited.
Do you tend to look at the stock data too, or you only look at flows?
Yeah, so we only look at flows, and there's really good reason for this actually. So the flow data tells us, it gives us literally a snapshot of a single moment in time, because flows are, by their definition, annualized, right? So we know exactly how many people come in that year. As soon as we mix in stock, we are muddying the waters. Because what happens is stock is telling us about the decisions that a state makes, not 1 year, over a course of 50 years, right? So we have certain countries that have been very liberal maybe in the past. Maybe think about like Latin America, where you have a lot of migrants coming in mid-century, right? But actually have limited migration today, with certain exceptions. So that would be distorting. That would be distorting to actually look at stock data, because suddenly we're not actually giving you that annual snapshot that we're advertising. And so for that reason, we exclude stock data from the algorithm. That said, we have a whole chapter on stock. So we have a chapter 3, I believe, in the book, is a chapter that looks at the history of the governance of migration regimes and the trends across time. And it's global reach. It's a really, I had a lot of fun writing the chapter. I don't know that it would ever be published on its own, because it's just, it's wafer thin, because you're trying to cover so many countries across so much time. But it was really fun to write, and that we use stock data to actually justify a lot of our findings there. So hopefully that'll be satisfactory. But we don't want to include it in the algorithm because it muddies the waters.
Question, I'm not even sure if I'm framing it properly, but have you thought about issues like the development of businesses rather than individual workers? Because certainly here in New York City, there is an enormous number of foreign-owned businesses and opportunities where folks like, I'm just thinking of Arcadis, the company that did all of the resilience work after Sandy, is a firm from Amsterdam. And the idea that there would be international opportunity for business development, does that affect who's hired under the conditions that they're hired, and what international firms are thinking about when they want workers or want to influence other companies and countries where they have business?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's kind of at the boundaries of my expertise. So the U.S. government gives out notoriously very few highly skilled work visas, H-1Bs, and there are country caps as well. So you have enormous queuing, both of employers and migrants, to get them. They're precious. As a result, you have seen employers make use of / exploit visas for purposes that they were not created for. So they could be seasonal worker visas, intercompany transfer visas, variety of other temporary labor visas, where you are effectively getting the work that you need, but in a non-permanent manner. That sometimes even supplants American labor and pays them at wages that may be appropriate for the country of origin, but not appropriate for the country of destination. So countries are adapting to an environment in which immigration is not facilitated for them, and they're just using other visa types. I don't want to go too far beyond that because you're at the frontiers of my knowledge. That's how you know someone knows what they're talking about, is when they tell you what they don't know, by the way.
Okay, yeah, wonderful talk. Just a quick observation comment. So could you call this like the return of the market model? If you look at migration flows to Europe, United States right after World War II, and thinking back then, how is that similar and different to what we see happening right now?
So I just warned you that that history chapter was wafer thin, and then you want to just dig into it for yours. Yes, you could. You could say that. I don't think it was as global in nature. When we look back in the past, no, I'm going to revise. We can't say that. The reason why we can't say that is the examples of the guest worker model in the past and the market model in the past was really geographically limited. What really defined migration regimes in the mid to early 20th century was the racialization of migration. And really, the quotas were not about, purposes of entry, but really about where you were from and what you looked like. And that was really what was the defining element of that era. So while this is not the first time we see in this guest worker model, this Uberization of work approach being put into practice, in some ways it lingered since that time after going to a period of dormancy. I don't think that's what characterized immigration regimes in the early and mid-20th century.
Any other questions? Here's some closing remarks
No.
for us. Oh, Dalia, go ahead.
No,
just very quickly. I know that it's
Just introduce yourself.
I'm Dalia Yusuf, and I'm a student at the Master Program at the CUNY Graduate Center. And I'm applying to the program of the migration. Yes.
Hint, hint.
I know.
It's a great, of course, research and very informative. But I would like to ask you, because you mentioned at the end of the presentation that if you want to help the immigrants, you should put like a face on the information or something. That you don't think of like integrating kind of more ethnographic information. Of course, when it comes especially to the Gulf region and the Arab world, I know the problem of the access to information. But I know also that many researchers are working on actually featuring, the stories of the immigrants and trying to, like some Lili Sharka, for instance, and you have also like kind of like writers and novelists working on this, because it's very difficult in the political atmosphere there to address the problem directly. So don't you think of like integrating kind of like highlights, like ethnographic information, something that might help?
In my own work?
Yeah, actually to make like, to put a context, to put this information into a context, especially in the Arab world or
Yeah. So Dalia, you don't grant friends yet, but you're preaching to the converted. So both of my first two books are based on full immersion ethnographies, 6-month-long ethnographies of the people I study. This book is different. It's a departure. And it's because I think that I recognize the value of large-scale statistical data along with the power of human stories. And the truth is we need both. And they both play an important role, and they complement one another. And so it's these stories that tell us that, that the trends that we see in human stories and human lives are not exceptional. That they're part of a global phenomenon of actually making people more precarious, more transient, and more contingent. And it actually shows us that this is not, it can't be dismissed as a one-off when we read these ethnographic works, which is something that I have experienced with my own work before. And so I hope that this will complement that work itself.
Final question.
Hi, I'm Tolu from Rutgers University in Newark. My question is around your data on visas. I was wondering if you and your co-author considered data on visas that are revoked, and using that as sort of an indicator of if there is any movement between what might have been considered humanitarian but was instead sort of more for economic reasons.
What do you mean by remote?
Revoked.
Oh, revoked. We definitely don't have that data across 30 countries, so I'm sorry to say. I end up saying this a lot, we don't have that data, we don't have that. Because when you see a project like this, it gets exciting, right? You're like, oh crap, this data exists. It's like, yeah, but that's all that exists. It's like anything we could get across 30 countries, we slapped up there. And unfortunately, it's hard to find.
Okay, and the second question I have is, do you see any sort of conversation between your Nomad data and your visa data moving forward in different projects?
Do I see...
The Nomad data that you showed at first, and then...
Do I see connections between them?
Yeah, and what's the future of those data?
Absolutely, absolutely. Countries know that when you keep immigrants contingent, they don't have the foundation, literally the physical foundation, to make rights claims against you. Because they are by their nature precarious, or their visa type is contingent, and they don't want to rock the boat. When you give someone citizenship, when you enfranchise them, when you give them permanent residence, you give them a platform to actually make claims against the state. And that's precisely what is making states get nervous, get cold feet about signing up to international agreements that compel them to protect those rights. And so there are two acts of defense being applied by governments. One is to deny the opportunity to reinforce global standards that compel them. And the second is to ensure that they undercut immigrants who actually enter their territory from actually making these claims. Sorry, everyone. That was uplifting. Have a nice day.
Thank you so very much, Justin, for a really great talk. Thank you so much. We'll restart with the third panel in 5 minutes. I just want to invite you, if you want to go for seconds.